Good evening and welcome back to Dreamtime Documents. Tonight, we are going to sit with one of the most extraordinary collections of stories the human mind has ever produced. A world so vast, so layered, and so deeply alive that even after more than 2,000 years, it still shapes the movies we watch, the books we read, the constellations we see when we tilt our heads back on a clear night. Tonight, we are going to cover the entire Greek mythology, from the very first breath of chaos to the last wanderings of heroes who could not find their way home. All of it, every god, every monster, every doomed king, every impossible labor, every war that began with a golden apple and ended with the collapse of a world. If you are settling in for sleep right now, I want you to let this wash over you like a slow tide. There is nothing to memorize. There is nothing to test yourself on. Just let the stories breathe. Let the names roll through your mind like music and drift wherever you need to go. And wherever you are in the world tonight, I am glad you are here. Now let us begin at the only place we can, the very beginning, where there was nothing at all, and then, somehow, everything. In the beginning, there was chaos. Not chaos the way we use the word today, not traffic jams and spilled coffee and unanswered messages. This was something far older and far quieter. Chaos was the primordial void, a dark, formless, absolute emptiness that existed before the idea of existence had even arrived. The ancient Greeks imagined it as a yawning gap, a deep and airless space where nothing had yet been given a name, because names require things, and things did not yet exist. Hold that image in your mind for a moment. A stillness so total that even silence would have been something. A darkness so complete that light would have been an impossible dream. That was the beginning, that was chaos. And then slowly from that absolute nothing, the first things stirred. The first to emerge from chaos were the primordial forces, the beings who were not quite gods in the way we will come to understand gods, but who were more like the raw materials of reality itself. Gaia rose first, and she was the earth herself, solid and breathing and ancient from her very first moment of existence. Then came Tartarus, the deep sunken abyss that would become the lowest place in all of creation, a pit beneath even the underworld where the worst and most powerful beings would eventually be imprisoned. Then came Eros, primordial desire, not the winged archer we will meet later in the story, but something far more elemental, the force that draws things toward each other, the pull of connection that makes creation possible in the first place. And from chaos also came Erebus, darkness made into a being, and Nyx the night, ancient and magnificent, whose veil draped itself across the sky from the very first evening. These were not personalities the way Zeus will be a personality or Athena will be a personality. These were forces wearing forms. They were the stage before the play could begin. Nyx and Erebus came together in the dark, and from their union came Aether, the bright upper air that fills the realm of the gods, and Hera, the day herself, so that light and darkness traded places in the first rhythm the world had ever known. Gaia did something remarkable in these earliest moments. She gave birth alone, without a partner, because she was the earth, and the earth contains everything. From herself she produced Uranus, the starry sky, to cover her on all sides and be her equal.
She also brought forth the mountains, those great ridges of stone that would become sacred places for centuries to come. And she produced Pontus, the deep and sterile sea. And then Gaia and Uranus came together as partners, sky lying over earth the way the sky always lies over the earth, close enough to touch on every horizon. What they made together was extraordinary and strange, and in some cases terrifying. Their first children were the three Cyclopes, not the single wandering giant of later stories, but beings of immense divine power: Brontes, who was thunder; Steropes, who was lightning; and Arges, who was brightness. They each had one enormous eye set in the middle of their foreheads, and they had a talent for making things that would eventually change the shape of history. The thunderbolts of Zeus himself would one day come from their forge. Then came the Hecatonchires, the 100-handed ones, three brothers of monstrous and awe-inspiring proportions. Their names were Cottus, Briareus, and Gyges. Each of them had 50 heads and 100 arms. When they moved, the earth trembled. When they reached out, they could touch the sky and the sea at the same time. They were not evil, but they were overwhelming, and that made all the difference.
Uranus looked at the Hecatonchires and felt something close to horror. He could not love what he could not look at without flinching, so he did what frightened fathers sometimes do in myth. He pushed them back. He shoved them deep into the earth, back into the body of Gaia herself, and locked them there in a dark place. Gaia felt them imprisoned inside her like stones swallowed whole. She felt their weight and their anger and their grief, and her own grief hardened into something that would eventually crack the sky. Then came the Titans. The Titans were the second generation of divine beings born from Gaia and Uranus, and they were magnificent in a way that is hard to put into words. Not monstrous like the Hecatonchires, not elemental like the primordial forces, but something closer to what we imagine when we imagine gods. Enormous, powerful, ancient, and possessed of something like personality. There were 12 of them in this first great generation, 6 brothers and 6 sisters who formed the original divine family. The brothers were Oceanus, Coeus, Creus, Hyperion, Iapetus, and Cronus. The sisters were Thea, Rhea, Themis, Mnemosyne, Phoebe, and Tethys. Let their names sit with you for a moment. These are not just names. Each one is a world. Oceanus was the river that the ancient Greeks believed encircled all of the known earth, a vast, slow-moving ring of fresh water at the edge of the world. He married his sister Tethys, and together they produced the 3,000 Oceanids, water nymphs who filled every river, spring, and stream. Every drop of moving water in the world was their child. Hyperion, whose name means the one who goes above, was a titan of heavenly light. He and his sister Thea produced 3 children whose names you will know immediately: Helios the sun, Selene the moon, and Eos the dawn. When the sun rose each morning in the ancient world and painted the horizon in shades of gold and rose and deep amber, that was Eos riding ahead of her brother. When the sun moved in its great arc through the sky, that was Helios driving his blazing chariot from east to west, holding the reins of 4 fire-breathing horses whose hooves struck sparks across the sky. Mnemosyne was memory itself, the force that holds the past in place and makes it possible to learn. She would one day be united with Zeus, and from that union would come the 9 muses, the goddesses of inspiration who breathed life into poetry, music, history, astronomy, and all the arts. Themis was divine law, the deep rightness of things, not the law that kings make and unmake, but the law that bends before it breaks, the kind of order that exists whether anyone enforces it or not.
And then there was Cronus, the youngest of the Titan brothers. And here is where the first great catastrophe begins. Gaia had been watching her husband Uranus lock away her children in her own body for a long time now. She had felt the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires pressed against her insides like secret prisoners, and her pain had become something else. It had become resolve. She fashioned something out of gray flint, harder and sharper than anything that had ever existed before. Some accounts call it an adamantine sickle. She gathered her Titan children and she asked them a simple question: which of you will do what must be done? One by one her sons fell silent. Oceanus looked away. Caius found something important to study in the middle distance. Creus did not volunteer. Iapetus shook his head. Hyperion said nothing. But Cronus stepped forward. He was the youngest, and perhaps that is why he had not yet learned to be afraid of his father. He took the sickle from his mother's hands. He hid himself and he waited. And when Uranus descended toward Gaia in the evening, as he always did, when the sky came close to the earth the way it always does at dusk, Cronus rose and struck with the sickle. The wound inflicted on Uranus, that severing act, sent drops of blood falling down onto the earth. From that blood Gaia received new life directly into herself, and from those drops sprang strange and powerful beings. The Erinyes, who are better known as the Furies, were born from that blood. 3 terrible sisters named Alecto, Megaera, and Tisiphone. Their purpose was to pursue and punish those who broke the bonds of family and blood. They would walk the earth forever after, hunting the guilty with torches and serpents and a relentless patience that time itself could not outlast. Also from that blood came the giants, enormous and fierce, and also the Meliae, the ash tree nymphs, who would eventually become the mothers of the bronze-hearted human race. And then there was what was cast into the sea. Something fell into the water that evening, and from the white foam that gathered around it a figure rose. She stepped up out of the waves, fully formed and strikingly beautiful, her feet barely touching the surface before she settled onto the shores of Cyprus. Her name was Aphrodite. She was born of sea foam and severed sky, and she came into the world already carrying the force that would complicate every story that came after. Uranus was diminished but not destroyed. As he withdrew, wounded and furious, he cursed his son with words that would ring out across centuries. He told Cronus that the same thing would happen to him one day, that his own children would rise against him, that the pattern of the father overthrown by the son was not finished. It was only just beginning.
And Cronus, who had just done the most daring thing any being had ever done, heard the curse and decided he knew how to prevent it. Cronus took his sister Rhea as his queen and sat down on a throne made of the deep sky and the shaking earth. And for a time the world enjoyed what later Greeks would call the Golden Age. This was a mythological period of perfect peace and ease, when humans, if they existed at all, lived without toil or sorrow. When the earth gave its fruits freely, when no one grew old before their time, and when nothing had yet gone wrong in any serious way. But something was wrong, something at the center. Cronus had freed the Titans from Uranus's authority, but he had not freed the Cyclopes or the Hecatoncheires. He had left them in their deep prison, because he too found them too large and too ungovernable to want nearby. Gaia, whose pain had launched the whole revolution, was not at peace. And somewhere in the back of Cronus's vast and ancient mind, the curse of Uranus sat and waited like a stone beneath still water. So when Rhea began to give birth, Cronus did what the curse had made him afraid to leave undone. He swallowed his children. One by one they came, and one by one he took them. Hestia, the first, who would become the goddess of the hearth and home, he swallowed her. Then Demeter, goddess of grain and harvest. He swallowed her. Then Hera, who would become his queen if she had been allowed to grow. He swallowed her. Then Hades, dark and quiet, destined for the underworld. He swallowed him. Then Poseidon, who would have made the seas his kingdom. He swallowed him too. Rhea watched her children disappear and felt something tear in her that she did not think would ever fully heal. When the sixth pregnancy came, when she knew another child was on the way, she could not bear the thought of doing it again. She went to her mother. She went to Gaia. And Gaia, who knew what it meant to have your children locked away inside you against their will, helped. When the child was ready to be born, Rhea wrapped a large stone in swaddling clothes, the kind of wrappings an infant would have been bundled in, and she handed it to Cronus. He, expecting the child he had been told was coming, took the bundle, tilted back his head, and swallowed the stone whole. He did not notice the difference. The real child was spirited away to Crete, to a cave on the slopes of Mount Ida, and there he was raised in secret by a group of divine nurses called the Curates. They made tremendous noise with their shields and spears whenever the infant cried, so that the sound of his voice would not travel up to his father. A divine goat named Amalthea nursed him, and the legends say that when he accidentally broke off one of her horns, it became the cornucopia, the horn of plenty that would forever after overflow with food and flowers and every good thing. The child thrived in secret, growing in strength and intelligence, learning the shape of the world and his place in it. His name was Zeus. When Zeus grew to adulthood, Gaia provided him with a powerful drink, a mixture that would undo everything Cronus had swallowed. Zeus gave it to his father, and Cronus shuddered and vomited. First the stone came up, which was later placed at Delphi as a sacred object, the omphalos, the navel of the world. Then came the gods he had swallowed. And they came out fully grown, fully formed, fully powerful, and very, very ready. Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, Poseidon. Out they came, blinking and breathing and drawing themselves to their full height. And the war that Uranus had predicted, the war that Cronus had eaten 5 children trying to prevent, was about to begin. The war between the Titans and the Olympians lasted 10 years, and the Greeks measured it in the kind of terms they used when they wanted to describe something that shook the foundations of absolutely everything. Mountains shook, the sea boiled, the sky cracked with sound and with light. It was not simply a battle, it was a rearrangement of the cosmos. On one side were the Titans, led by Cronus, ancient and enormous, and backed by generations of accumulated power. On the other side were the 6 freed Olympians and their new ally Zeus, young and fierce, and burning with the kind of purpose that comes from never having had what was rightly yours. For the first years of the war, neither side could gain a clear advantage. The Titans were too established, too powerful, too accustomed to ruling. The Olympians were too new, and numbers did not favor them. Something needed to tip the balance. Zeus remembered what Gaia had told him. She had advised him to free those who had been imprisoned unjustly, because the imprisoned, she said, would fight hardest for whoever freed them. Zeus descended into Tartarus, that deep pit beneath the earth where the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires had been locked away since the days of Uranus. He broke their chains, he brought them food and nectar and let them breathe free air for the first time in an age so long that the number of its years could not be counted. The Cyclopes, grateful beyond measure, made gifts. For Zeus they made the thunderbolt, that weapon of shattering electrical fire that would become his symbol and his signature for all of history.
For Poseidon they made the trident, the three-pronged spear that could split the earth and churn the sea into mountains of foam. For Hades they made the helmet of invisibility, which worn on the head of the god of the dead would make him vanish from sight entirely. The Hecatoncheires fought alongside the Olympians, and when they threw rocks they threw hundreds at a time, each arm hurling boulders the size of hillsides with a force that made the Titans reel. Not all of the Titans fought for Cronus. Some chose a different side, or no side at all. Oceanus stayed neutral, continuing his slow circular path around the world. Prometheus, one of the children of the Titan Iapetus, sided with the Olympians because he had the gift of foresight and he could see how the war would end. His brother Epimetheus also came over to the Olympian side. Themis, divine law, aligned herself with the young gods, knowing that the cosmos required a new order. In the 10th year, with thunderbolts crashing and the Hecatoncheires hurling mountains, the Titans broke. They fell, one by one and then all at once, and the victory belonged to Zeus.
Cronus and the Titans who had fought against the Olympians were cast down into Tartarus, that same deep pit where the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires had once been imprisoned. An enormous bronze gate was forged. Poseidon sealed it with walls of bronze and a darkness that had no bottom. The Hecatoncheires were set as guards outside those gates, and there the Titans would remain, sealed away from the light of the world they had once ruled. Some later traditions gave Cronus a gentler ending. In certain versions of the myth, he was eventually pardoned by his son and sent to rule over the islands of the blessed at the edge of the world, a paradise where the most virtuous heroes went after death. It is possible that even Zeus, who had every reason in the world to leave his father in chains, found some mercy at the end of a very long story. But that comes much later. For now, the war was over. The cosmos needed new rulers, and three brothers stood on the threshold of a new age and divided the world between them. Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades drew lots for the three great realms of existence. This was the fairest method they knew, and even among gods, fairness has its place when the alternative is another 10-year war. Zeus drew the sky, and with it the role of king of all the gods, the ruler of Mount Olympus, the one who kept order among the divine and the human alike. His symbol was the thunderbolt, his bird was the eagle, and his sacred tree was the oak. He sat on a throne of cloud and marble and gold at the peak of Olympus, and from there he could see everything that moved beneath the sky. Poseidon drew the sea. He built a palace beneath the waves, filled with gold and coral and the light that filters down through deep water in those blue and green columns that make you feel the surface is very far away. He drove across the waves in a chariot pulled by white horses, and when he struck the ocean floor with his trident, the earth shook. The ancient Greeks felt every earthquake and imagined it was Poseidon, restless and powerful, shifting his weight below the ground. Hades drew the underworld. Some accounts describe him as the unluckiest of the three brothers, taking the darkest and most silent realm, while his brothers had the sky and the sea and all that sunlight. But Hades himself did not see it that way. He was a precise and serious god, not evil the way later traditions sometimes painted him, but stern and implacable. He ruled his kingdom with an absolute consistency. No one left his realm without his permission. Death was the one appointment no one missed. His helmet made him invisible. His black chariot was pulled by black horses, and his court was the most orderly place in all of creation because nothing there ever changed.
The earth itself, the surface where humans and animals and plants lived out their days, was shared by all three. Technically, it was Zeus's realm as the Sky King, but its waters were Poseidon's, its depths were Hades's, and every living thing that walked or crawled or flew across it belonged in some way to all of them. And then the new rulers settled on Olympus, that mountain wrapped in eternal cloud in northern Greece, and began to build the world that the myths describe.
Mount Olympus was not quite a physical place in the way you might imagine a mountain. It was both a real location, the highest peak in Greece at just over 2,900 meters, and a mythic space, a realm above the clouds where the gods lived in palaces made of light and bronze and marble, where they banqueted on ambrosia and drank nectar, where they gathered to discuss the affairs of gods and humans in a palace whose doors opened by themselves when the hours pulled back the heavy clouds that served as gates. Zeus was the king, the lord of the sky and all of creation, the thunderbolt wielder and the final authority. He was not a perfectly good ruler in any simple sense. He was complicated and sometimes infuriating, and his romantic adventures created a significant portion of Greek mythology on their own. But he held the world together, and there is something to be said for that. Hera was his queen, the goddess of marriage and the queen of heaven. Her symbols were the peacock and the cow. Hera is often described as jealous, and it is true that she spent considerable energy pursuing and punishing the mortal women and half-divine children that Zeus's wandering eye kept producing. But to reduce her to jealousy alone is to misread her. She was the goddess of the sacred bond between husband and wife, and Zeus's endless violations of that bond were a direct insult to everything she represented. Her anger was the anger of a principle being undermined again and again by the very person who was supposed to uphold it. Poseidon ruled the seas, but his influence extended to horses, earthquakes, and storms. He was competitive with Zeus in a way that occasionally spilled into open conflict. His rivalry with Athena over the city of Athens is one of the most famous competitions in all of mythology. He struck the rock of the Acropolis with his trident and produced a salt spring. Athena planted an olive tree. The gods voted for the more useful gift, and Athens became Athena's city. Poseidon was not entirely gracious in defeat. Demeter was the goddess of grain, harvest, and the fertile earth. She was warm and generous under normal circumstances, and her gifts of agriculture and the knowledge of planting and reaping were what allowed human civilization to exist at all. When she was happy, the earth was bountiful. When she was not, the fields went still. Athena was the goddess of wisdom, crafts, and strategic warfare, and she entered the world in the most dramatic fashion possible. Zeus had lain with the Titaness Metis, goddess of cunning intelligence, and when she became pregnant he was warned by a prophecy that the child of Metis would surpass its father in power. Zeus swallowed Metis whole, but Metis inside him continued to work. She forged a helmet and armor for her daughter, and the hammering inside Zeus's head grew so unbearable that he finally went to Hephaestus and asked someone to split his skull open and relieve the pressure. When the blow fell, Athena sprang out fully grown, fully armored, shouting her war cry, her eyes bright and gray as a winter sea. She was the goddess of intelligence applied to purpose, which is perhaps the most powerful kind of intelligence there is. Apollo was the god of light as it relates to truth, prophecy, music, poetry, and medicine. He was the most beautifully formed of all the gods by most accounts, radiant and golden, carrying a silver bow and a lyre whose music could stop rivers. He spoke through his oracle at Delphi, and what the oracle said shaped the decisions of kings and cities for hundreds of years. Artemis was Apollo's twin sister, daughter of Zeus and the Titaness Leto. Her birth came with its own ordeal. Hera, furious at Zeus's union with Leto, had forbidden any land or fixed point on earth to offer Leto shelter for her labor. Leto wandered without rest until she came to the floating island of Delos, which was not technically fixed and therefore not technically subject to Hera's ban. There she gave birth first to Artemis and then to Apollo, with Artemis reportedly helping to deliver her own twin brother. She roamed the wild places of the earth with her band of nymph companions, carrying a silver bow, and she had a fierce protectiveness of purity, both her own and that of those who served her. Ares was the god of war, but not the strategic, intelligent kind. He was the pure, brutal force of battle, the blood and noise and indiscriminate violence that no one celebrates until they need it. Even the other gods found him unpleasant much of the time. Zeus openly stated in the Iliad that he loved Ares least of all his divine children. His associates were his twin children Phobos and Deimos, fear and terror, and his companion was Eris, the goddess of discord, whose role in events will become very important when we reach the story of the Trojan War. Aphrodite, who we have already met rising from the sea foam, was the goddess of love and beauty and desire. She was married to Hephaestus, which was an arrangement neither of them seemed entirely comfortable with. Her power was not a gentle thing. She was the force that made people lose their reason, abandon their principles, and do things they could not explain afterward. She was given the golden apple in the end, and what she did with it started the greatest war in the ancient world. Hephaestus was the smith god, the craftsman of Olympus, the maker of divine weapons and palaces and mechanical wonders. He was the only god who was physically imperfect. His lameness, either from birth or from being thrown from Olympus, depending on the version you read, set him apart from the gleaming beauty of the other gods in a way that made him more sympathetic, more human, and in his own way more interesting than almost any of them. His forge was said to be located under volcanoes, which was why volcanoes smoked and rumbled, and the things he made, Achilles' shield, the chains that held Prometheus, the golden automata that walked and spoke, were marvels that no human craftsman could ever equal. Hermes was the messenger of the gods, but calling him merely a messenger is like calling the ocean merely wet. He was the god of travelers, thieves, merchants, athletes, eloquence, wit, and the boundary between the living and the dead. He could move between all realms freely, from Olympus to the underworld and back, which was the exclusive privilege of no other deity. He was born on the same day he invented the lyre, by stringing a tortoise shell with cattle gut, and he stole the cattle of Apollo on his very first day of existence, and then talked his way out of trouble so charmingly that Apollo forgave him and accepted the lyre as a trade. That story tells you everything you need to know about Hermes. Dionysus was the last to join the Olympian 12, and his story was different from the others in ways that reflect the fact that his worship arrived in Greece later than that of many other gods. He was the god of wine, theater, ecstasy, madness, and liberation, the divine force that dissolved the boundaries between the self and something larger. He was the son of Zeus and a mortal woman named Semele, and he was born twice. His first birth was interrupted when Semele was tricked by Hera into asking Zeus to show himself in his full divine form. The resulting blast of divine fire burned her to ash. Zeus snatched the unborn child and sewed him into his own thigh, and when the time came, Dionysus was born from the thigh of his father. This double birth, first of a mortal woman and then of a god, gave him a connection to both worlds that would define his entire mythology. Hestia, goddess of the hearth, was the first child of Cronus and Rhea, and therefore the first swallowed and the last returned.
She presided over the domestic fire, the hearth that was the center of every Greek home and every Greek city, and every offering to any god began and ended with an offering to Hestia, so that she was present in every act of worship even when she was not named.
The gods had their realms, their thrones, their purposes, but the earth was still quiet, and the question of who would fill it with something other than silence led to one of the most philosophically rich stories in all of Greek mythology. The task of creating living creatures was taken up by the Titan Prometheus and his brother Epimetheus. Their names are already a story. Prometheus means forethought. Epimetheus means afterthought. One plans ahead, one makes a mess and then thinks about what he did. Epimetheus was given the task of distributing gifts to all the animals of the earth, the qualities and tools that would allow them to survive. He went through the animal kingdom with tremendous enthusiasm and very poor accounting. He gave the swiftness of legs to the deer. He gave the fur against the cold to the bear. He gave talons to the eagle, and armor to the tortoise, and venom to the serpent. By the time he had finished, every animal had been equipped generously, and when he came to the last creature, the naked two-legged being that was to be the human race, he had nothing left to give. Prometheus looked at his brother's work and looked at the naked, cold, helpless creature that stood shivering in the wind with no claws, no fur, no wings, no venom, nothing. And he made a decision. He climbed the path to heaven and he stole fire from the forge of Hephaestus. He carried it down to earth in a hollow fennel stalk, the way fire can be carried in a dried plant without burning it from the outside. And he gave it to the humans. Fire changed everything. It meant warmth in winter. It meant the ability to cook food and make it safe to eat. It meant light in darkness and the possibility of metalworking and pottery and all the crafts that follow from the ability to transform materials by heat. It meant, in other words, civilization. With fire, the humans could begin. Zeus looked down and saw the fires lit on the earth and was furious, not simply because the theft had been committed, though that was an insult of enormous proportions. He was furious that the order he had arranged had been broken by someone who should have known better. Whatever the specific reason, Zeus's anger at Prometheus was total, and his punishment was designed to last. He had Prometheus chained to a rock, not a comfortable or temporary binding, but an absolute one, fastened with chains that only Hephaestus could make, driven through the rock itself with spikes of iron. There Prometheus was left, exposed to the full force of the sky. Every day an eagle descended, and the eagle ate his liver, the organ the ancient Greeks believed was the seat of life and feeling and passion. Every night, because Prometheus was immortal, the liver grew back, and every morning the eagle returned. This went on for what different sources describe as 30 years, 3,000 years, or simply an uncountable age, until Heracles, one of the great heroes, eventually passed that way and killed the eagle and freed Prometheus from his chains. But that story belongs to a later chapter. First, we need to meet Pandora. Zeus was not done with humanity. The punishment of Prometheus addressed the theft, but Zeus wanted something more. He wanted to introduce into the human world a kind of complication that would make sure the gift of fire was accompanied by its own price. He commissioned Hephaestus to make a woman from the earth and water, the first woman in the world, and he called together all the gods to give her gifts. Aphrodite gave her beauty and grace and desire. Athena taught her weaving and practical intelligence. Hermes gave her eloquence and the mind of a thief and a heart full of flattery. The Graces adorned her with golden jewels. The Hours crowned her with spring flowers. Zeus himself gave her the crowning quality, a curiosity so deep and so restless that nothing could satisfy it except knowing. Her name was Pandora, which means all gifted, and she was sent to earth with a sealed jar, which later tradition would come to call a box, and which has been imagined as a box ever since. Epimetheus had been warned by his brother Prometheus to accept no gifts from Zeus. But when Pandora arrived, beautiful and charming and standing in the sunlight with all the gifts of the gods on her, Epimetheus accepted her as his wife immediately and did not ask what was in the jar. Pandora's curiosity, the one gift from Zeus that was designed to be inescapable, eventually overwhelmed her caution. She opened the jar, and what flew out was everything that had been sealed away from human experience until that moment. Illness, sorrow, envy, spite, old age, despair, and the whole catalogue of sufferings that make a human life difficult. They escaped in a cloud, and they scattered across the earth, and they have never been gathered back in. But at the very bottom of the jar, before Pandora slammed it shut in horror, one last thing remained. It had not escaped, it stayed. What remained, pressed against the curved bottom of the jar, was Elpis, hope. That detail, small and placed at the very end of a story about disaster, has been discussed and debated and interpreted for as long as Greek mythology has been studied. Was hope remaining in the jar a mercy, kept safe from the world so that it could be found when needed? Or was hope being kept captive in the jar another punishment, something deliberately withheld? The ancient Greeks did not settle the question, and perhaps they meant not to. Some questions are more useful open than closed. The poet Hesiod, writing in the 8th or 7th century before the Common Era, gave us the most complete picture of what the ancient Greeks believed about the sequence of human history. He described 5 ages, each one a generation of humanity made by the gods and eventually replaced by another. The Golden Age was first. The humans of the Golden Age lived under the rule of Cronus, in a time of perfect ease. They never aged. They knew no labor, no war, no sickness. The earth gave its fruits without being asked. They feasted and laughed and lived until they simply fell asleep and did not wake up. When they died, they became good spirits who wander the earth still, invisible guardians of humanity who watch over mortals with gentle attention. The Silver Age came next, and it was already a significant step down. The humans of the Silver Age took 100 years to grow from infancy to adulthood, and when they finally became adults, they lived only a short time and spent it badly. They refused to honor the gods, they were proud and quarrelsome, and Zeus eventually wiped them out for their impiety. The Bronze Age brought a harder human, made of bronze, fierce and strong and interested in little besides warfare. They made their houses from bronze, they fought constantly, and they destroyed themselves through their own violence, descending into the underworld unnamed. Then came a brief, luminous interruption. The Age of Heroes was not part of the progressive decline, but a shining interlude. The period of demigods and great adventurers, the age of Heracles and Perseus and Achilles and Odysseus, and all the great names we are about to meet in detail. These were the children of gods and mortals together, extraordinary beings who walked the earth and accomplished things that nothing quite like them would accomplish again. The greatest of them were eventually taken to the islands of the blessed, that paradise at the edge of the world where the heroic dead rested in eternal ease. And then, Hesiod says, came the Age of Iron, which is the age he himself was living in, and which he described with a mixture of resignation and grief.
an age of toil and injustice, where the good are punished and the wicked prosper, where families are broken by greed, where children do not respect their parents, where honor is a word people use while doing the opposite. He believed it would end badly, and he was not particularly hopeful about the timeline.
Before we move into the heroic age and the great individual stories, we need to sit with Prometheus a little longer, because what he did and what was done to him in return is one of the central moral questions of Greek mythology. Here was a titan who saw a creature without defenses and gave it the one thing that could change everything. He knew the punishment in advance because his name means forethought, and he did it anyway. He looked at the eagle on the horizon every single morning and made the same choice again in retrospect. He did not recant, he did not ask for forgiveness, he did not explain himself to Zeus in terms of submission. In the tragedy Prometheus Bound, attributed to Aeschylus and written in the 5th century before the Common Era, Prometheus is still defiant on his rock, still arguing that what he did was right, still carrying the dignity of someone who made a choice and stands in it completely. What makes this story remarkable is that Prometheus is suffering for a gift given to people who in the immediate moment of the myth have not done anything in particular to deserve his sacrifice. He gave fire to humanity as a class, to the naked shivering thing that Epimetheus had left without resources. And the individual humans who benefited from that gift had no idea what it cost. This is one of the reasons Prometheus became such a resonant figure, not just for the ancient Greeks, but for centuries of thinkers and artists afterward. He is the prototype of every person who has ever been punished for knowing something that power would rather keep hidden. Every figure who is born suffering to give others something they could not have obtained for themselves. Zeus eventually allowed his release, partly because Heracles freed him in the course of his own labors, and partly because Prometheus possessed knowledge Zeus needed, specifically the knowledge of which divine union would produce a son powerful enough to overthrow his father. That prophecy, the very same kind of threat that had haunted Uranus and Cronus, was hanging over Zeus too, and only Prometheus knew the details. When Zeus finally had Prometheus freed and the two came to an agreement, the last of the great divine imprisonments ended, and the world settled into something like its permanent arrangement. Before the stories of the heroes can begin properly, we need to understand what the relationship between gods and humans actually looked like in practice, because it was not the distant relationship of a creator who makes something and watches from afar. It was intimate, contractual, and constantly active. The Greeks understood their gods as beings who were interested in human behavior, interested in being honored, in receiving their due, in having their altars tended and their festivals celebrated and their names spoken with appropriate reverence. The technical term the Greeks used for this was piety, and the word for its dangerous opposite was hubris. Hubris is usually translated as pride, but it is more specific than that. It is the particular attitude of a human who forgets the distance between the human and the divine, who behaves as though the gods can be ignored or equaled or surpassed, who reaches past the limits of the human in a way that constitutes not just arrogance, but an active insult to the divine order. Every great tragedy in Greek mythology has hubris somewhere in its mechanism, and we will see it drive characters to ruin with a consistency that is almost mathematical. The oracle at Delphi was the most important point of contact between the divine and the human in the ancient Greek world. It sat on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, above the Gulf of Corinth, in a place the Greeks believed was the center of the world. At its heart was the temple of Apollo, and within that temple sat the Pythia, the priestess of Apollo who served as the channel through which the god spoke. The Pythia sat over a fissure in the rock from which vapors rose. She entered a trance state, and what came out of that trance, when interpreted by the priests of the sanctuary, became the oracle's pronouncement. The answers were famous for being true and impossible to misunderstand until after the fact. Croesus, the wealthy king of Lydia, was told that if he crossed the Halys River to attack Persia, a great empire would be destroyed. He attacked. The empire destroyed was his own. The oracle had been perfectly accurate. Greek temples were not primarily gathering places for congregations the way later religious buildings would become. They were houses for the god, the place where the cult statue lived and where offerings were made. Worship happened outside, at the altar that stood in front of the temple where animals were sacrificed, incense was burned, and wine was poured into the ground. The smell of burning offerings, the ancient Greeks believed, was what the gods enjoyed, and the smoke of sacrifice rose up to Olympus where the gods breathed it in and were pleased, or were not, depending on the circumstances. Festivals marked the year. Athens had dozens of them, each one dedicated to a specific deity or a specific aspect of divine concern. The Panathenaea, held every 4 years in its grand form, honored Athena and involved processions, athletic competitions, and the presentation of a newly woven robe to the ancient olive wood statue of the goddess in the Erechtheion on the Acropolis. The Thesmophoria was a festival of Demeter celebrated exclusively by women over several days in autumn, connected to the myths of fertility and the underworld. The Dionysia gave Athens its theater, because the dramas of Sophocles and Euripides and Aeschylus were performed as religious offerings to Dionysus, not simply as entertainment. The gods were everywhere, in the fire on the hearth, in the spring at the edge of the field, in the crossroads where Hermes's cairns of stone marked the boundary between here and somewhere else, in the storm that sent a fleet sideways across the sea. The Greek world was a densely divine environment where every natural force had a divine presence behind it, and the job of a thoughtful human being was to navigate that presence with respect. No account of Greek mythology is complete without a thorough visit to the realm that every human being was destined to enter. Because the Greeks thought about death and the afterlife with extraordinary imagination and extraordinary specificity, the underworld was not a place of punishment for the wicked as opposed to paradise for the good in any simple sense. It was more nuanced and more democratic than that. Nearly everyone went to the same place, and that place was a dim, gray, quiet kingdom somewhere beneath the earth, reached by crossing a river that separated the living world from the realm of the dead. The geography of the underworld, as the ancient Greeks described it, began at the river Styx. This was the boundary, the great oath river that even the gods swore by, because breaking an oath sworn on the Styx brought consequences that not even Zeus could avoid. A ferryman named Charon waited at the bank. He was ancient, ragged, and perfectly indifferent to your situation, but he required payment. The Greeks placed coins on the eyes or under the tongue of their dead specifically to give them the fare for Charon's boat, because without the coin, the dead could not cross. They wandered the near bank for 100 years before Charon would take them across without payment. On the other side, the dead passed by the 3-headed dog Cerberus, who guarded the entrance with a terrifying thoroughness. He allowed the dead to enter but permitted no one to leave. Every story of a living person entering the underworld involves somehow getting past Cerberus, and the solutions are various. Music, a honey cake for each head, the paralysis of sleep induced by some divine means. Once inside, the dead came to the plane of judgment where the 3 judges sat, Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, all former kings of great justice in life, now heard the cases of the dead and decided where they would spend eternity. The asphodel meadows were the destination of most ordinary souls, those who had lived neither with great virtue nor great wickedness. They wandered there in a dim, grayish half-existence, neither happy nor in pain, simply present. The way a faded photograph is still a presence even when the color has drained away. The ancient Greeks considered this the typical fate, not a punishment, just the diminished continuation of what it had been to be alive. Elysium, or the Elysian fields, was the destination of the heroic and the virtuous, a sunlit paradise at the western edge of the world where the blessed dead lived in something approximating the happiness they had deserved in life. The most exceptional among them eventually reached the islands of the blessed, a more perfect paradise still. And then there was Tartarus, the deepest pit, which served now both as the prison of the Titans and as the place of torment for those whose crimes had been so enormous, so specifically offensive to the gods, that ordinary oblivion was insufficient punishment.
Here were the famous punishments of mythology. Tantalus, who had killed and cooked his own son and served him to the gods at a banquet to test whether they were truly omniscient, was punished by standing in a pool of water beneath a fruit tree, with the water receding every time he bent to drink, and the branches rising every time he reached for a fig. Sisyphus, who had cheated death twice and tricked his way out of the underworld, was condemned to roll an enormous boulder up a hill for eternity, and every time he neared the top, the boulder rolled back down. Ixion, who had attempted to seduce Hera herself, was bound to a wheel of fire that spun forever in the wind. Theseus, a giant who had attacked the goddess Leto, lay spread across 9 acres of ground, while 2 vultures ate his liver endlessly. The underworld was ruled by Hades and his queen Persephone. Hades himself rarely left his kingdom. He had no cult in the way other gods did, no temples to speak of, because the ancient Greeks were understandably reluctant to call attention to him. They called him by a euphemism instead, Pluto, meaning the wealthy one, because all precious metals and gems come from beneath the earth, which is his domain, and all people eventually come to him, which is the greatest wealth of all. Demeter, the goddess of grain and the great fertility of the earth, had one daughter who was everything to her. Persephone, sometimes called Kori, meaning simply the girl, was young and luminous, and she spent her days in meadows with the nymphs, picking flowers in the long warmth of a world that was then permanently spring. Because her mother's happiness kept the earth green and open, Hades had noticed her. He had spoken to Zeus about it, and Zeus, who found the whole situation complex, had not said no. One day in a meadow in Sicily, Persephone reached for a flower, a narcissus of extraordinary beauty that the earth had produced in just the right spot. As her fingers closed around the stem, the earth split open with a tremendous noise, and from the crack in the ground came Hades in his black chariot behind his black horses. He seized Persephone and took her down into the darkness before she could do more than call out for her mother. Demeter heard the cry. She did not know who had taken her daughter. She did not know where to look. She lit torches and she walked the earth for 9 days and 9 nights without eating or sleeping or bathing, looking everywhere, asking every being she encountered whether they had seen her daughter. Most knew nothing. Most had seen nothing. Only Hecate, the goddess of the crossroads and liminal places, had heard the cry but not seen the abduction. Only Helios, the sun who sees everything that happens under the sky, knew the truth. When Demeter learned that it was Hades who had taken Persephone, and that Zeus had either permitted it or failed to prevent it, her grief turned into something else. She withdrew from Olympus. She came down to the earth in the form of an old woman and wandered among mortals. She stopped working. She stopped causing the grain to grow. She withdrew the gift of her divine productivity entirely, and the earth went still. Fields dried and cracked, grain stopped germinating, orchards stood bare, animals found nothing to eat, humans faced a famine of a kind that had no precedent, and they had no offerings to give the gods because there was nothing to harvest, which meant the gods received nothing either. Zeus eventually recognized that this situation was unsustainable. He sent messenger after messenger to ask Demeter to return, and she refused every one. She would not return until she had her daughter back. Zeus sent Hermes to the underworld to retrieve Persephone, but here was the complication. Persephone had eaten in the underworld. She had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds, 6 small red morsels of the fruit of the dead, and the ancient law of the underworld, older than Zeus and older than the Olympians, held that anyone who ate the food of the underworld was bound to it. They could not leave permanently.
The compromise that was reached had the shape of all the best mythic explanations, the kind that explains something you can observe. Persephone would spend 6 months of the year in the underworld with Hades because she had eaten 6 seeds. During those months, Demeter would grieve, and the earth would reflect her grief. Leaves would fall, fields would go dormant, the cold would come, and for the other 6 months, Persephone would rise back to the surface, and her mother would be overjoyed, and the warmth would return, and the green would come back, and flowers would appear in the meadows where Persephone once played. This was winter and spring explained. The Eleusinian Mysteries, one of the most important religious institutions of ancient Greece, centered on this myth. Held at the town of Eleusis near Athens twice a year, the mysteries were initiation rites performed for thousands of years, kept rigorously secret, and promised to their initiates a better relationship with death and the afterlife. Exactly what happened inside the inner sanctum at Eleusis has never been disclosed, because the initiates kept the secret even under Roman rule. But the myth of Demeter and Persephone, the descent and the return, was at the heart of it. The gods loved, and they loved with the same intensity and lack of moderation that characterized everything else about them. The love affairs of the Olympians were not romantic subplots. They were engines of the mythology, driving the creation of new heroes, the punishment of mortals who attracted the wrong divine attention, and the birth of half the creatures and demigods that populated the ancient world. Zeus was the most romantically prolific of the gods. With Metis he produced Athena. With Themis he produced the seasons and the fates. With Mnemosyne he produced the 9 muses, spending 9 nights with her to produce all 9 daughters at once. With Leto he produced Apollo and Artemis. With Hera, his official queen, he produced Ares and the goddess Hebe, cup-bearer of the gods. With the mortal Semele he produced Dionysus. With the mortal Alcmena he produced Heracles, who would become the greatest of all heroes. With the mortal Leda he came in the form of a swan, which is one of the stranger stories in the mythology, and which produced Helen, whose beauty would eventually launch the Trojan War. And the divine twins Castor and Pollux. Apollo fell in love more than once, and not always successfully. He pursued the nymph Daphne, daughter of the river god Peneus, and she ran from him. When he was about to catch her, she called out to her father for help, and was transformed into a laurel tree. Apollo adopted the laurel as his sacred tree in her memory, wearing a laurel wreath from then on. He fell in love with the mortal Hyacinthus, a beautiful Spartan youth, and was training with him when Zephyrus, the west wind, who also loved Hyacinthus, deflected Apollo's discus in jealousy. It struck Hyacinthus in the head and killed him. Apollo, unable to reverse death because it was not his domain, turned the boy's blood into the hyacinth flower and inscribed on its petals the sound of his grief. Aphrodite's affair with Ares was the worst kept secret on Olympus, and it came to a memorable end when Helios reported it to Hephaestus. Hephaestus the smith forged a net of bronze so fine as to be invisible and spread it over the bed. He then told Aphrodite he was leaving on a journey. Ares came immediately. When the two were together in the bed, the net snapped tight around them and held them in place. Hephaestus then called the gods of Olympus to come and look, which they did, and the laughter of the gods rang through the divine halls while Ares and Aphrodite lay trapped and furious, unable to move. Eventually they were released, and the story has the shape of a comedy, but underneath it is a portrait of a marriage built wrong from the beginning. Two beings as mismatched as a forge and sea foam, assigned to each other by the arrangements of the divine without any regard for what they were actually like. And now we come to the heroes, those extraordinary beings who stood between the world of the divine and the world of the purely human, born of one parent from each side and driven by a purpose that ordinary mortals could not have withstood. Perseus was one of the first and one of the greatest, and his story begins with a prophecy, because in Greek mythology, prophecies almost always come first, and the attempt to escape them provides the plot. Acrisius, king of Argos, was told by an oracle that his grandson would kill him. He had only one daughter, Danae, so the solution seemed obvious: prevent Danae from having children. He locked her in a bronze chamber, sealed away from every man on earth. Zeus came to Danae as a shower of golden light, and so Perseus was born. A child of a god and a mortal woman, born in a sealed room built to prevent exactly this. When Acrisius discovered what had happened, he could not bring himself to kill his daughter outright. So he put Danae and the infant Perseus in a wooden chest and cast them into the sea. And the sea, and Zeus who watched over it, brought them safely to the island of Seriphos, where a fisherman named Dictys found them and raised Perseus as his own. Perseus grew up on Seriphos, a child of the sea and the shore, not yet knowing what he was. And that is where we will leave him tonight, on the shores of an island, the son of a god and a king's daughter, with a destiny he does not yet suspect. The story of Perseus and the Gorgon and the monster at the shore and the princess on the rock is waiting for the next chapter. But for now, the world is quiet. Olympus rests under its eternal stars. The heroes are sleeping, and so are you. Sleep well. The myths will be here when you wake.